Welcome to the second software primer. This software primer is going to be covering the basics of Adobe Photoshop, which is the image editing software included with Adobe's Creative Suite of software. Much like InDesign, Adobe Photoshop is a very specific and specialized piece of software, although it could be adapted to be used for multiple things. Anytime you think about editing images or processing images, as people sometimes call it, I want you to think of Photoshop as your first stop. Although it is possible to do some limited editing of images and content using Illustrator or InDesign, Photoshop is a much more powerful tool for these particular tasks, and it is the best tool that we have available to us. So let me just confirm some settings on my recording, and we will begin right away. So when you open Photoshop after a splash screen, you may have some tools in your workspace already, but if you don't, it is possible that you could open up Photoshop and have a blank workspace, such as the one that I have here. And the way to access the most important tools that we're going to need is to navigate to the Window drop-down and to first select Layers. Layers are even more critical in Photoshop than they are in InDesign. Along with my layers, it seems as though my layers are stuck to a bunch of other tool palettes. I can actually click this and have it pop out on its own, fly out on its own. I'm going to X out of these other options because layers is really all I'm concerned with for today's tutorial. I'm going to click and drag my layers palette. Sometimes this is also referred to as your layer stack because of the way that layers are organized. And when I hover over the right side of my screen, just like with InDesign, I get this blue bar that appears indicating me it's going to dock on the right side of the screen. If you are working with two monitors, it may be helpful to bring this onto another screen and really maximize your workspace. Also under Window, I want to make sure that Tools is checked. And just like with my layers and just like with InDesign, I'm going to hover over to the left until I get this blue bar indicating that my tools will dock over there. So now I have my tools on my left, my layers on my right, and I'm ready to begin working. If I were creating a new document from scratch, much like with other pieces of software on a Windows machine, I would navigate to File and select New. And it's going to give me this dialog box for a new file where I can specify the size of the document in either pixels or inches. So if I knew a specific size, like let's say I was working on a letter-sized piece of paper, I might specify that it were to be 8.5 by 11. And since in this class we are always working with print in mind, we want to increase our resolution to 300 pixels per inch. 72 pixels per inch is the default with Photoshop when you're creating a new document, but this is not desirable for our purposes, as 72 is an on-screen resolution which will not print nicely. And I will demonstrate that momentarily, or rather some of the principles of resolution. So you can also open an existing document, and the way that that is accessed is by navigating to File, Open, and I'm going to browse for the same image that I worked with in the last software primer. You can choose to work with any image that you prefer to look at. You may recall from the previous primer that we were looking at the Farnsworth house. So when we are opening up a new image, the most important thing to check first of all is its size. So by default we have these rulers that are visible to us. You'll notice this ruler here and this ruler here on the sides of the screen. Much like with InDesign, I'm going to activate my selection tool. I could click and drag on them and bring guides onto the canvas. Unlike InDesign, they are not directly selectable to delete, but we can click and drag them back onto the rulers to get rid of them. If we want to check the size rather than just visually, because right now this is seeming to indicate to me that this image is 22 inches wide and 15 inches tall, which seems unlikely to me given that it came from a Google image search. We're going to navigate to Image up at the top and select Image Size to look at its properties. So it's correct that the image is currently 22 inches wide and 14 inches high, but that is at a resolution of 72 pixels per inch. So the absolute dimensions of the image are always going to be these top two up here, which are telling us how many pixels of information there is in the image. So I could change the resolution to 300 pixels per inch, and Photoshop would tell me that the image is a larger pixel size now, but this is a bit of a false indicator, as Photoshop cannot really invent new pixels for an image. Rather, this would just be stretching out the existing pixels that we already have and splitting them into additional pixels, and the image would not be at any higher quality. Likewise, if we were to drop this down to a lower resolution, which we never recommend you do, but just to illustrate it, you would be losing information and there would be fewer pixels than we began with. And it's also telling us that the pixel dimensions were 4.87 and now they're 2.35. So really, the way that you want to adjust the resolution of your image is to make sure that this option down at the bottom to resample the image is unchecked. And what that's going to do is it's going to lock the dimension of the image in terms of its actual true pixels, and it's going to allow us to control the resolution and the width and the height independently of the actual information contained therein. So if I bump up the resolution to 300 pixels per inch, as we're asking you to do, you'll notice that the size of the document has changed from 20 some inches to 5.3 or 3.54. And the reason this is important, so let me go ahead and say OK with this. And I'm going to do a save as. I'm going to save this as another copy. I'm going to call this one Farnsworth House 300 DPI. Hit OK. If I were working in InDesign and trying to place my images at their full resolution, this first one, when I dropped this in, when I clicked and dragged, it would come in as its full size of 22 inches wide, so on and so forth. But if I clicked and dropped in the 300 DPI image, this is going to come in at a true size. And if I were to export this and then print it, this larger one, even though I haven't stretched the image, I'm dropping it in at what Adobe thinks is its full size. It's going to be printing blurry. Because the resolution is not sufficient for printing on paper, whereas this one is going to be nice and crisp and it's going to look just as high quality as it does on the screen. So always be cognizant of the relationship between pixels, resolution, and the image size. So size and resolution are not the same, and you always want to make sure that when you are adjusting the size or the resolution of your image that you have resample unchecked, because that will prevent us from accidentally stretching the image in a way that we don't want to. It is possible to crop an image in Photoshop. I don't recommend that you use Photoshop to do this, as you'll be losing information, and InDesign is perfectly capable of cropping images, but there may be occasions when this is necessary. For example, if you're not going to take the image to InDesign. There are two ways to do so. The first is with the rectangular marquee tool. This is one of the most commonly used tools, so you may as well get familiar with it now. We can click and drag using this tool, and we will get this dancing rectangular frame on our page. If you want to get rid of it, you can simply click on it again or click outside of the frame. I can also use my keyboard, hold Control and hit D. It's D for deselect, and that will get rid of all frames that I've drawn on the screen. Whenever I'm making a selection in Photoshop, I can draw a frame and then I can hold Shift to add to that frame. So if I decide that I want to go a little bit bigger or I want to add another frame outside of it. Excuse me, I seem to be having a little bit of computer problems. So if I hold Shift, you may notice there's a small plus sign that appears next to my cursor. I could add another frame and they will sort of merge together and make one big weird shaped frame. I could also subtract from the frame by holding Alt. You'll notice that when I hold Alt and click and drag, I get this little minus sign next to my cursor. So that's a convenient way to subtract from the frame. And when we're done drawing our frames, let's say that I've grabbed everything in the house that I want to have, I can navigate to the menu bar, the menu drop down, say Image, and then choose Crop. And what this is going to do is it's going to find the furthest extents of all of the frames that I've drawn. So it's going to go to this corner, it's going to go to this far out corner because this would carry across and imply a rectangle, and it's going to go as far over here as it possibly can, and it's going to crop this to a rectangular shape that corresponds to all of the frames that I've drawn. And you'll notice that it's cropping just to the extents of that marquee. So I'm going to hold Control and Alt and hit Z. Photoshop has a function called Step Backwards, which is kind of like a super undo, and that's what I recommend you work with if you are stepping forwards or backwards in your document, because it will allow you to undo multiple steps. And very often we're doing a series of operations with Photoshop, so you may find that you need to step backwards several times. In addition to the rectangular marquee tool and image crop, we can also use the crop tool, which is in our toolbar. It is this square icon with a dash through it, or a diagonal slash through it. One of the advantages of the crop tool is that at the top it allows us to specify an aspect ratio or a proportion for our document. So I could tell it that I wanted it to be 2:1, and it would lock me into that proportion. So when I manipulate my crop frame by hovering over the handles and adjusting them, it's going to always maintain that proportion. There are also a series of presets here. I believe that I had square selected before. I can click and drag around the image to choose exactly what I want to crop. I can change the size of it using these handles, and it's always going to maintain that same aspect ratio of a square. Just to illustrate. And when I have decided that I'm happy with whatever I've cropped my document to, I simply hit Enter on my keyboard, and it has been cropped. Again, I don't recommend that you use Adobe Photoshop to crop your images, but it is a capability of the software. So if you need to print something directly and you are not going to lay it out, it may happen that you need to crop, particularly for composition, or if you are editing a scan or a photograph of a model, for example. Another thing to be aware of is that Adobe has multiple color modes that can be accessed from the image dropdown. If we navigate to image and look at mode, this is telling me by default that our image is in RGB color space, which is the most common color space for working with color on a computer, because computers think of color in terms of red, green, and blue, mixing those three together to create all the colors in the visible spectrum. CMYK color, is commonly used in printing. Although we are going to be printing our documents, I recommend that you work in RGB color space, because not all of the same editing options are going to be available to you if you choose to move into CMYK color space. Indexed color, I also do not recommend working in. It will limit the palette of colors to a fewer range of tones, and you'll get a less natural looking image. It will look kind of computerized, and you're going to lose some image data. Same thing with grayscale. Grayscale will turn your image to black and white, and you are going to lose all of your color data. It is possible to change your image to black and white without losing the color data permanently, and I will show you how to do that momentarily. It may also happen that if you open an image that was originally scanned, for example, in grayscale mode, some scanners will set themselves to grayscale when you are scanning a drawing. You may have to change the image out of that mode to RGB color in order to get some of the options that we're going to talk about in this video. So be aware of the image color mode and check that it is not in grayscale if you are having a hard time accessing all of the options that we talk about. So the first thing to talk about is adjustment layers. And adjustment layers are what is called a non-destructive editing technique, meaning that anything we do to adjust our image is going to it's going to be possible to undo it later and restore the image to exactly what it originally was. And that's desirable because we're going to be continually manipulating our Photoshop images, and we want to make sure that we could always restore them to how they were if we need to. So I'm going to activate my background layer. By default, my document only has this one layer, and I want to be able to move it around if necessary. So I'm going to double click it. You'll see that it has this padlock icon on the side, and I'm not going to change the name right now. I think that layer 0 is okay. When I hit OK, you'll see that the padlock has disappeared, and now my layer is active. I can turn it on or off, just as with InDesign. When I turn it off, you'll notice we have this checkerboard background, which is not actually a checkerboard that will print. This is simply Photoshop's way of telling us that there is nothing there. Rather, this is transparency, or the absence of all color or images. So I'm going to turn on my layer, and I'm going to navigate to the bottom of my layer stack to this button that looks like a black and white cookie. And if I hover over it, it's just out of frame for you on the video, I believe, but it's telling me that I have the option to create a new fill or adjustment layer. And when I click on that, it's going to give me all of these options here. So these top three here, solid color, gradient, and pattern, those are called fill layers. We are not going to talk about those today, but they are an important component of Photoshop. Rather, we are going to talk about the adjustment layers, which live below that line. So we have brightness and contrast, levels, curves, exposure, so on and so forth. The first one that I'll talk about is brightness and contrast. When I select this, I get a whole bunch of options that all these palettes that pop out. I'm going to get rid of a few of these because they're not necessarily necessary. But it has generated this additional layer in my layer stack called brightness and contrast. And if I double click on the adjustment icon in that layer, it is going to bring back those properties. Really, this is the important one here, the properties palette, so just make sure to look for this one. And this one has two sliders, brightness and contrast. Brightness does exactly what you would think it does, where it sort of increases the apparent exposure of the photograph. If you've ever worked with film photography, this is kind of simulating the effect of keeping the lens open for longer and letting in more light, or keeping the lens open for a shorter amount of time and letting in less light. Again, it's just simulating that. Contrast manipulates the amount of difference between what is dark and what is light in the photo. So if I were to bring contrast all the way to the left, it's going to soften the image just a little bit, and the difference between bright and dark is going to seem less apparent. If I bring it all the way to the right, it's going to make it a little bit punchier and sharper. As with all adjustment layers, you should be judicious with these and be careful. We very seldom want to slide a slider all the way to the left or the right for any of these. So move incrementally and test things in conjunction with other adjustments, because we can do multiple adjustments to one image and control them all independently. So we have adjusted the brightness and the contrast of our image. If we go back down to our fill and adjustment layers button, we can also look at the levels. Levels I find to be, I'm going to turn off my brightness and contrast adjustment too, so we can really see just what the levels are doing. Levels I find to be one of the most useful adjustments in Photoshop. When we add a levels adjustment layer, it's going to give us this palette that has what is called a histogram, and this is illustrating the range of values that are present in our image. So when I talk about values, I'm really talking about sort of how close to absolute black or how close to absolute white any particular tone is, regardless of its color. So this green has a certain proximity to black or white that could be equal to this orange in here. Even though they are different colors, they may share a brightness. So that's what this histogram is tracking, is the amount of brightness in the image. And it's telling us that there are a lot of darker tones in the image, but then it kind of falls off and there aren't a lot of super bright tones in the image. So if this histogram really started in the middle of the image, if it were just occupying this area, a common editing technique using levels is to take the black slider and the white slider and to drag them to meet the extents of the histogram, so that the darkest tone in the image becomes an absolute black and the brightest tone in the image becomes an absolute white. Rather, just bringing them in a little bit on either side with an image like this is going to really make the image a little bit punchier. It's sort of similar, I'd say it's adjacent to the contrast slider in the brightness and contrast options. This middle slider controls where the 50% gray point falls. So we can bring our tones closer to all being an absolute black or all being an absolute white by doing this. These two sliders at the bottom control how Photoshop reproduces an absolute black. If we bring the black towards the white, then absolute black starts to be reproduced as more of a gray. And if we bring the white slider in, absolute white starts to be produced as more of a gray. So this is a way of sort of flattening out the range of images. This is a kind of visual compression that's happening. If we were to bring them both towards the middle, everything would go closer to gray. Really, it's less likely that you'll be using those sliders though, and if I turn this on and off just to illustrate what it did, using levels is a really nice way to punch up your model photographs, especially since the histogram gives you a visual indication of what tones or what values are already present in the image. So I'm going to turn that off. Let's talk about the next adjustment layer. It is also useful to be aware of hue and saturation. So if I select hue and saturation, every image by default has a bit of a color cast to it. Nothing is truly neutral, and this is a way of changing the tint of that cast using the entire visible spectrum. This could also be represented as a circular wheel, as the far left side of this slider meets up essentially with the far right side. And as I play with this, you will start to see what I'm discussing. So we're beginning sort of in the blue color range, So anything that's blue is going to first, as I drag this to left, go closer to green, then closer to yellow, then closer to red. And if we were to go to the other side, that's the red here, then it would go closer to magenta, blue, and then back to where we started again. So you'll notice that, likewise, anything that's green starts to move towards yellow, then red a little more quickly, then magenta. So the grass is magenta by the time we get here. Then it's moving into the blue range, and then finally back to where it began as a green color. So if you have an image that has a bit of a specific cast, say for example you photographed a model using an incandescent light bulb and it has an undesirable white cast, or excuse me, yellow cast, you could use this to manipulate it a little bit. You can also reduce the cast of an image by dropping the saturation down. As a matter of fact, if we drop the saturation all the way to 0, we will lose all color from our image and it will become black and white. If we bring it all the way up to 100%, it will again start to sort of visually compress our image in an undesirable way where we get a lot of distortion, very psychedelic looking, but not in a desirable way. So again, you want to be very judicious with all of your sliders and how you are making these manipulations, as they have a big effect with just a little bit of work. And you don't want to go overboard with any of them. We want to be very subtle with our adjustments. Finally, the adjustment that I wanted to talk about is the black and white adjustment layer, which can be found 2 below hue and saturation. And if we add this to our layer stack, everything below it, because layers affect everything that is below them, is going to turn to black and white. And this gives us a lot more control than changing the image color mode to grayscale. And it also does not discard the color information from our image, so it's desirable for 2 reasons. So this basically reads the image and affects anything in these color ranges, so it allows us to control the brightness of these different color ranges. Anything in the yellow range, such as the cabinetry in the house, I can make it first go darker or brighter. Same thing with the greens, for example, all of the grass in the foreground. So this is a nice way to sort of isolate the different aspects of our image and play with them and get a lot of control over exactly how our color image gets turned into black and white. I'm going to turn that off. So that is the essentials of adding adjustment layers to your image and working with non-destructive editing techniques. There are several editing techniques that you will have to use which are destructive, which doesn't mean that they are bad uniformly. Rather, it just means that they can't be undone, so we need to be careful about how we apply them. So one of the techniques that I like to use when I'm about to do a destructive editing procedure is I like to duplicate my layer. So I'm going to double click on layer 0 and I'm going to call it safe. Double clicking on a layer is how you rename it. And it's helpful to rename your layers something useful and keep them very organized, because it can happen that when you have a Photoshop document you've been working on for a while, this layer stack fills up and it gets very confusing if you haven't been naming things. So if I right click on my safe layer, I can navigate to duplicate layer. Allows me to specify a name for the new layer, and I'm going to call it edit. So the principle here is that I've created one called safe, which I'm never going to edit. This one is going to be preserved exactly as it always has been, so I'm going to turn it off. And edit is the image that I really want to work on. So the most useful edit for much of the work that you're going to be doing in this class will be using the clone stamp tool, which is a way of visually sampling an image and then duplicating it to another part of that same image. The clone stamp tool is the keyboard shortcut S, or it's this icon in your toolbar that looks like a rubber stamp. If I click on it, it's going to create a brush tip. Here, if I hover outside the canvas, you can see that I have this circular area. Your brushes, the way that you can manipulate the size and shape of them, that's up here in the upper left-hand corner. I prefer to actually use my keyboard. If I use my brackets, I can use the left bracket to make my brush tip smaller until it's just a tiny little hairline, or I can use the right bracket to make it larger, really as large as I want it to be. For an image of about this size, the size of your brush tip is going to depend on how delicate the clone stamp adjustment you're making is going to be. Because I want to illustrate this in a very visible way, I'm going to use a relatively large brush tip. Much like InDesign, the scroll wheel can be used to zoom in and out. Your copy of Photoshop may be set up so that you don't need to hold any other keys. You can just scroll and you'll be able to zoom. That's my preferred setup. It may also be that your copy is set up so that you need to hold the key Alt on your keyboard while you scroll in order to zoom. But Photoshop requires a lot of zooming in and out, so be prepared to get very close to things where you can see every individual pixel, and then also look at them very far away. When you're zoomed in, another quick shortcut that I find useful, if you hold spacebar on your keyboard and click and drag, it allows us to pan around. So this is a nice way to stay at a specific zoom level and then move around the document effectively. So the clone stamp tool requires a little bit of forethought. We need to plan exactly what we want to do and how we want to achieve it. For argument's sake, I'm going to say that I want to create the illusion that this house is continuing from here right out of frame. So that imagine that this house doesn't stop here, that it just keeps going. So one of the ways that I could achieve that is I could sample the image here and then essentially cut and paste it over here. So I'm going to try and be strategic about this. I'm going to activate my clone stamp tool. I used S on my keyboard. And I'm going to pick somewhere that I can easily visually identify something like it. So I'm going to start with this column. If I hold the Alt key on my keyboard, my mouse cursor turns into a crosshair, and I can click once. It doesn't appear as though anything happened, but you'll notice that when I let go of Alt and I start moving my mouse around, I have this piece of the image that's stuck to it now. And the reason that is that we have sampled that piece of the image. So I've zoomed out again and I've come over here. So we've sampled that piece of the image. And I'm in Photoshop. And now I'm going to align this with something that looks more or less the same from somewhere else in the image. I'm going to locate that column. I'm actually going to make this a little bit smaller using the bracket tool because I'm getting some undesirable noise from the side. And I'm going to start painting with it. And what this is doing, if we zoom out we can see it, is it's just copying exactly what we saw over to our left, and I'm able to paint it over here to the right. So this is a really clever and easy way, and I didn't line this up perfectly because there's a little bit of perspectival distortion, but that's a way with very little effort that we can start to correct things or make manipulations to our images. And because this was a destructive editing technique, meaning that we changed the original image, we always want to make sure that we are working on our edit layer and not the safe layer. So I had the edit layer activated this whole time. If I turn it off, you'll see that the safe layer is still exactly as it was before underneath. So that's a brief introduction to the clone stamp tool, which is extremely powerful. I recommend you explore how that works on your own. Another thing to talk about is that we can make selective adjustments using what is called a layer mask. So it may happen that you want to select everything that is orange, such as the cabinetry in this image, and you want to perform an adjustment to just that. The way that I would recommend doing so is to use, we have a bunch of these marquee tools up here. We have the rectangular marquee tool, we have a polygon lasso tool, which we can use to just sort of draw and trace things. This is a very common one, especially when you remember that if you hold Shift, you can add to your selection, and if you hold Alt, you can subtract from it. If you have a very steady hand, you can use the lasso tool, just the freehand lasso tool, and draw this way. There's also a magnetic lasso tool, which will sort of naturally want to stick to the contours of things. So this one's a little bit trickier because it depends on how well the computer wants to acknowledge what you're tracing and how steady your hand is, but it's a great way to get a very fast selection. But if we're doing something based on color, very often the best selection tool is going to be the magic wand, which is below the magnetic lasso and the other lasso tools. If I select the magic wand, I have one or two variables to think about up at the top. There's tolerance and there's contiguous, yes or no. Contiguous means that it's only going to look at the specific image or the specific area of the image we're clicking in and things that are touching it. If we deselect contiguous, it's going to be sampling the entire image. So keep that in mind if the magic wand is behaving in an unpredictable way. Make sure that you've thought about whether you want to be contiguous or touching areas or non-contiguous, meaning the whole image. Tolerance is how sensitive the magic wand is going to be. If it's set to 0, it's going to be very picky, and it's only going to select colors that are just like the ones that are next to it. If you set it all the way to 100, it's going to be a lot looser, and it's going to select bigger areas that are sort of similar to each other. For this particular exercise, I don't necessarily know how high the tolerance needs to be set, so I'll start with 50. as a guess. Halfway isn't a bad place to start. And you'll see that I've gone ahead and clicked on a piece of the cabinetry with my magic wand tool, and it's sampled the colors in here, and it's grabbed everything that's sort of similar. You'll see that it's grabbed this part of the cabinetry that's in shade, but it's also grabbed some of the curtain back here, which I did not want. So I'm going to turn the tolerance down to 30 and try that instead. That's much better. And now I'm going to hold Shift and click some other areas and keep clicking, keep sampling to get all the things in that color range. So that's pretty good, actually. I could come back in with one of my lasso tools later, or my marquee tool, hold Alt and subtract a piece of that to get a little bit more of an accurate selection. But I could also try, I'm going to hold Control and hit D on my keyboard to deselect everything. With my magic wand tool, I might also try non-contiguous, which is sometimes a little less picky, and if we just want to grab a specific color range. So if I start clicking orange, you'll notice that it's grabbing pieces of orange in the image that aren't just touching where I was clicking exactly. So I'm going to hold Shift and keep clicking, keep selecting, and that's actually done a pretty decent job of grabbing everything that I wanted it to. Whoops, I'm going to take a step backwards because I grabbed a little bit more than I wanted to really there. But this is not bad for a selection that was generated with almost no effort on my part. So I'm going to come in and clean up my selection a little bit. Just to illustrate a different tool, I will subtract this holding Alt using the polygon lasso tool. So here we have a selection that's a little bit larger than we want it to be. I'm holding Alt and I'm going to click and start drawing a lasso around all of the things that I want to subtract from my selection. I apologize, I'm having a little bit of computer difficulty. Yeah, it seems that the screen capture software I'm using does not like certain tools in Photoshop. It causes it to freeze, so I may not be able to illustrate this perfectly on screen. But the general principle is that you want to refine your selection. Here we go, I was able to subtract most of it out there. You want to refine your selection to just the area of the image that you want to work on. So I've got a selection that's, for our purposes, close enough to just the cabinetry. So I've generated this selection, and if I want, I can create an adjustment layer that's going to just affect that selection. So let's say we wanted to change the color of all of the cabinetry in this image. We might consider using the hue and saturation adjustment layer. So now that I've generated my selection, I'm going to come down to my adjustment layers, and I'm going to select hue and saturation, and you'll notice that it's generated a new adjustment layer, and it has this little thumbnail image off to the side of it. Before, when we were generating adjustment layers without having anything selected, they came in with that same thumbnail, but the thumbnail is all white. And what this thumbnail is indicating is what's called a layer mask. You could think of a layer mask as a piece of paper that someone is putting over your document. Where it's white, the paper has been cut through with a pair of scissors. Where it's black, the paper has not been cut through. So essentially what I'm saying is it's like you're laying a black piece of paper over something, and only where it's been cut out and it's white, that's what we're going to see. So basically we've created an adjustment layer where the only white in this little thumbnail corresponds to the cabinetry in this image. And as I start playing with this slider, you'll see that it's affecting just the color of the cabinetry and nothing else. So we could do something really wild and turn it to be purple cabinetry, for example. And if we change our mind, as with all the other adjustments that we've performed in this particular editing session, we can simply turn off this layer and no harm has been done because this is a non-destructive editing technique. We could also choose to remove the mask or disable it by right-clicking and saying Disable Mask, and now that adjustment is affecting the entire image. We could right-click the mask again and say Enable Layer Mask, and it's going to turn itself back on again and only affect that particular area. Layer masks are applicable to all parts of editing a document. We could also use a layer mask just as an illustration here. I'm going to turn off my safe layer. We could generate a selection using our rectangular marquee tool or say our polygon marquee tool. If I were to draw a marquee around the house generally, double click when I'm finished with this, sort of pick up this piece I missed at the end. You can generate a mask on an image as it exists by making a selection and then coming down here to this button next to the fill layer button that looks like the Japanese flag. If I hover over it, it's off screen for YouTube, but it says add layer mask, and when I click, it's going to generate that same kind of thumbnail where again I can see that it's only showing me where I've selected and it's not showing anything else. If I use my selection tool up at the top, I can move around the whole layer, but you'll notice that the adjustment layer above it is not moving with it. So this is something to be cautious of when you are working with masks. I'm going to undo that adjustment. It is possible to just move a mask and not the image underneath. And the way that we would do that is you'll notice that there's this chain link icon between the mask thumbnail and the image thumbnail. And if I click that chain link, it's going to unlink the two of them. So now, if I have my image selected, you see the way it has these white brackets around it, I can start moving that with the selection tool, and again the mask doesn't move. I'm going to undo, or I could select the mask and move that around and the image doesn't move. So you can imagine the way that we could work with stacking layers on top of each other and composing things carefully in using masks to really generate a very dynamic image very quickly and capitalize on all these non-destructive editing techniques. Again, I'm going to right click on this and say disable the layer mask because I don't actually want to do that. So when we decide that we are happy with our document, actually let me make one more note about masks. I'm going to enable this layer mask again to illustrate this point. Masks can be thought of as something that you can paint on. So you'll notice that they're black and white by default. Everywhere that's white, they are going to show through. Everywhere that's black, it's like somebody put the piece of paper on it. Remember the analogy from earlier. I could come over here to my tool palette and use my brush tool and make sure that I have black or white selected down here for my colors. This is the color that I'm going to be currently using. And if I had this mask selected, I could, and again like the clone stamp tool, I can use my brackets on my keyboard or up here to change the size and shape of my brush. And I could paint directly onto the layer mask. So I'm painting black, meaning I'm going to be covering up whatever's underneath it. And it looks as though I'm erasing the image, but again, if I disable the layer mask, you'll see that it's still there. And we're going to talk more about brushes in a future lesson, so don't worry too much about this. I'm just illustrating the principles of how masks work. If I were to flip the color that I'm working with and paint in white, it would start to show the image everywhere that I'm painting. So it's like a reverse erase. And some people are stunned by this because it appears as though I'm just painting and inventing an image, but really what I'm doing is I'm painting on the mask. So I'm just affecting what's visible. When we're satisfied with all the adjustments that we've made, I'm going to disable this layer mask. The first thing we want to do is navigate to File and choose Save As. And you always want to save a copy of your Photoshop file as a .psd file, and you want to make sure that layers are checked. And what this is going to do is it's going to save a copy of your image along with all of the layers and adjustments that you've performed to it. So when you come back here, a PSD file is the native Photoshop format that Photoshop is able to read. So it will open up the Photoshop file and all of your adjustments will still be there, and you can continue to manipulate it, and you'll still have the safe copy and everything that comes with it. But you'll also want to navigate to File, Save As, and save it as an image format that's flattened without the layers, such as a JPEG. So I'm going to go ahead and overwrite this other image that I saved earlier. So this is a workflow that I like to advocate for, where your live working files are always a .psd file, and then whatever file you're putting into your InDesign document is a .jpeg file. So now if we come back to our InDesign file, because even though we've been working on our Photoshop file, the PSD has been continually updated, we are using the same image file, the same .jpeg. So I can just click this little icon here, and it will update my image to reflect all the edits I've made in Photoshop. So this is a good example of a workflow between Photoshop and InDesign that's very effective, where you always keep a .psd file that has all of your layers organized, and then you save them down to a JPEG file, and you can continue to overwrite that JPEG as you update the image. So in this software primer, We covered the principle of resolution and checking resolution versus image size when you open something in Photoshop. Always make sure that you are working at 300 dpi if something is intended to be printed. We talked about how to how to crop your images, We talked about color modes and the importance of understanding what color mode you're working in, and the fact that some options will only be available in RGB. We talked about non-destructive editing techniques and adding adjustment layers. We talked about black and white, hue and saturation, levels, and brightness and contrast. And we also had a very brief introduction to the principle of masks. We talked about duplicating layers, using the magic wand tool, the quick selection tool, and the clone stamp tool. And then finally we talked about the .psd file format and saving your image as a .jpeg, a .tiff, or a .pdf that then gets updated in your InDesign file. So that concludes this software primer, and we will continue to upload more as we develop the content. Thank you for watching.